Today I am putting away my beloved Schmincke and Winsor Newton gouache, and I'm trading it for something very different. Arrtx sent me a box of their gouache in metal tins, which I found very curious. I am not sponsored by them at all, but they did send this for me to try and give an honest review. So that's what we're gonna do today. Let's open her up. Okay, we have a little postcard and business card and a printed swatch sheet. So not sure how useful this printed swatch sheet will be because a lot of times paint looks very different printed versus like fresh out of the tube or out of the tin in this case. So we'll definitely need to make our own swatch sheet. They're kind of shallow tins with screw tops, and they have the printed name and number on them on the top, which is very useful. And it looks like the top is it looks like the top is clear. That's transparent, so you can actually see what color is inside. And we get a pretty basic variety of the main colors that most people use. Let's take these out and do some swatching. As part of my test today, I'm going to be leaving the tins open while I'm painting. I'm not going to worry about closing them because I'm going to be grabbing from the tins as I go, because that is kind of, to me, that's the whole point of having something like this, is the convenience of not having to squeeze it out of the tube or like scoop it and put it on a palette. Let's take a look at one of them. The consistency. Okay, so when I tilt it at an angle, it holds its shape. It's not pouring out when I tip it upside down either. Wow. I thought it would be stiffer than that, but it actually looks quite creamy. Okay, well, it's all good to look at them, but it won't matter until we use them, right? So let's try that. Oh, I can see there's some dry gouache on the edge of this tin, so I'm probably gonna have to clean that off. I think that might be important to make sure they stay properly closed over time. Okay, let's open them up. Let's see what we've got. Unfortunately, they didn't give me a lemon yellow, which is my favorite yellow. I just love how I can get bright, clean mixes with lemon yellow. Quite a few of these have like a ton of paint around the lid, so that's gonna require some maintenance. So I'm gonna do a dark swatch and then I'm gonna do a watered down swatch next to it. Like kind of dragging it like watercolor, because I do dilute my gouache while I paint and I need to know how it's going to act and how it's going to look. Okay, I won't bore you with every second of my swatching, but I do want to mention that when I was swatching, I didn't see any difference between this gouache and my Schmincke or Winsor Newton. The only thing is that it did take a bit longer to dry. This is the Etcher Everyday Cold Press Sketchbook, which is 100% cotton. So I can't speak to the light fastness of these colors. As many of you know, gouache is notorious for being less light fast, at least certain colors. So not all gouache is not light fast. It's just that you have to really do your research about what pigments are in them. And it also varies brand to brand because they just use different sources of pigments. Got to do your own research for that. But I typically only use gouache for sketches, so it's not something I have to worry about unless I'm planning on selling a piece, and then I'll do like heavy research. Okay, last one is, what do they call it? Violet. PO23PBK7. It's like a eggplant mauve purple. It's not like it's a little more of a reddish purple. Okay, so I'm gonna let these dry and then see how they look when they dry. I was half expecting to see some shiny areas in the mass tone or in the thickest part of the gouache when it dried because it took so long to dry. However, it dried completely matte. And there's also no strange edges or splotching, which is a bonus. I typically paint with a limited palette, so that's what I'm going to do today in order to give this like a fair comparison to all my other gouache. So that said, I'm going to go with white, yellow, red. I think I'll go with the ultramarine because I know it the most from my other gouache. And I may also use black. There's just not enough space on my desk to deal with all of these tins, which, you know, as much as I like this idea of like a clear cover on the tin and how portable these are and how like they're basically spill proof as well. They just take up a ton of space on my desk. Maybe what I'll do is use like this much space for mixing and then do a big vertical painting on the right side. So on one hand, the tins take up a lot of space on my desk, but on the other hand, they don't take up space on my palette. So this is purely going to be for mixing, which is kind of nice. Problem is, like, when do you ever need this much yellow in one session? That's why I have something like this. This is much more manageable. On the other hand, it's nice to use a giant brush sometimes. Sometimes I use a 1-inch brush and I can't fit a 1-inch brush into these little slots. So that's when these tins might come in handy. So there's a lot of stuff to balance when you're thinking about the pros and cons of stuff like this. Black and white, you know, typically gives you a neutral gray. I can already tell this is a bit warmer. It's like a very warm gray. So their black pigment definitely leans towards warm. Blue and yellow make green. The yellow is going to be a mess by the end of this, I think. But hey, man, that's part of the test, right? So I'm able to get a nice deep turquoise, and then I can lean it more towards like an olivey green the more yellow I add. And if I was using Prussian blue, this would be even more intense. There's a nice grayish, purplish blue there. Pale desaturated green. See, these are the colors I'm much more drawn to. They're much more muted. So now we have a classic orange. Wow, that's still basically red. The red is so powerful. You need like a tiny bit of red. Let's desaturate that with the white. Get a fair amount of mixes there. Their website says that these are professional grade watercolors, so that means they fade less, they have less glue or less binder involved, they have more pure pigments involved. I've not tested it myself, I've not done a light fast test or anything like that, but just purely based on mixing these right now, they are very, very strong colors. And that's actually a challenge when you're trying to get soft muted tones. I think I will just focus on painting so I can really get to know the gouache and give it a fair comparison. And I may do a voiceover with some of my thoughts that I had during this process. So for this first painting, I decided to go as earthy as possible. I wanted to see how far I could stretch it without getting too muddy. Although I think you'll see in the final painting, I did lean a little bit more towards mud. But it's really challenging to get nice, earthy, muted tones when you have these intense, vibrant primaries. It's one of the big challenges of using a limited palette. Nothing is pre-mixed for you, so you have to very carefully mix little by little until you get the right tones. That said, having those intense, vibrant colors is also extremely useful because sometimes you actually do need a bright pop of color. So starting off with bright, intense colors and then being able to mix them down into those more muted tones is ideal. In terms of performance, when I was using it on this paper, I honestly didn't notice a difference between this and my really expensive gouache. So that was a huge surprise. After this painting, we're going to dive into a toned paper painting, which is not 100% cotton paper, and that's when I saw the difference. So we'll get into that in a second. But in terms of painting in this sketchbook, it was really enjoyable. I didn't notice any difference in how quickly or slowly the paint dried on my palette, and the only thing I did notice about that is as it slowly dried, it seemed to get a little bit more gummy. Not to the point where it was annoying or anything, but it was just an observation. Given the price of these, I was actually pretty shocked by the performance. It's not that I think cheap gouache is automatically going to have, crappy results or anything. It's just, honestly, it's so much cheaper than my usual gouache. I did expect it to act differently. I've used very cheap gouache in the past and it was a lot more chalky and weird. The binder was really weird. So this was a completely different experience. Again, I can't speak to the longevity or the light fastness of this paint, so I don't know how professional it is, but the experience was fine. But let's jump into my other test, which was on toned paper. This is not cotton paper, it's just really cheap craft paper. It's a sketchbook I bought at an art store ages ago, and I don't even think it has a brand name on it. But the more I paint with gouache, the more I like to be able to use it on any sketchbook that I have with me. I never know when the mood is going to strike, and if you've watched a lot of my videos, you know I paint outside a lot. I typically only carry 1 or 2 sketchbooks in my backpack at any given time, but I do carry a variety of materials to paint with. I've also been increasingly enjoying painting on toned paper with gouache because I love how it just pops off the page. So anyways, as I was painting this, I was just trying to observe how it absorbs or slides across the paper, just how it acts on the paper. And it was not enjoyable. So the thing is, I guess the binder of this paint is slightly different than the other gouache that I own. I don't know exactly the makeup of it, but I have a theory that it includes a bit more gum arabic, which is fine because that's what's going to make the paint really strong in the end. But because of that, it doesn't absorb into the paper as much as my other gouache. It seems to sit on the surface a little bit longer, and it almost has like a slightly gummy effect. And it doesn't slide as smoothly as my other gouache, even when I water it down. So it's an interesting thing to balance these pros and cons, because on one hand, this is so cheap that you can easily do tons of sketches with it and not worry at all. And yes, this does work on this paper. It was just a slightly more challenging experience. But, given the fact that I often paint in these various sketchbooks, I like my gouache to perform the way I want it to perform. I will probably just reserve using this gouache for my 100% cotton sketchbooks because it did so well. Some of you may have seen that I recently added Schmincke gouache to my permanent collection, and I have to say that it is my new favorite. But it is more than twice as expensive, possibly even 3 times as expensive as this gouache is. So again, it's something, a pro and con that I have to weigh. So in conclusion, I would say this gouache is a great one for anyone who's getting into gouache and doesn't know where to start because it's so affordable. I think it takes away some of that fear of investing in an expensive product, and it gets you used to how the paint acts. And because it is very similar to my other gouache in many ways, in my opinion, it's a great starter paint. And a final thought about the whole longevity and light fastness. I don't think you should ever take a manufacturer's word for light fastness because we've seen time and again that very often they're not that accurate. So you should always do your own tests on that. But for the most part, gouache isn't meant to be a permanent paint. Many people don't use gouache for permanent paintings that they're going to sell for that very reason. It's very often used as a sketching medium or as a medium from which you're going to make prints and sell prints of your artwork. So in that sense, the longevity doesn't matter at all. Each of you has to make your own decision about that aspect of it. But hopefully this video gave you a good idea of how this paint performs in my various tests. And of course, it's always going to be different for everybody, depending on how you use the gouache and what types of paper you use, your style of painting, and all of that. So if you enjoyed it, make sure you give it a thumbs up so YouTube knows I did a good job. And if you'd like to see more gouache videos in the future, make sure you subscribe before you go. Thanks everyone. I'll see you all again soon. Take care.